You have a problem. And it started 9 episodes ago. Not the problem you think. Not motivation. Not skill. Not even consistency. The problem is that you have been studying your mind instead of using it. That distinction sounds small. It isn't. In the year 2000, 2 professors at Stanford University published a book. Their names were Jeffrey Pfeffer and Robert Sutton. The book was called The Knowing-Doing Gap. Their central finding was this. Most organizations already know what they need to do to improve. They know it. They have read the research. They have attended the seminars. They have written the strategy documents. They have had the conversations. And they still don't do it. Pfeffer and Sutton spent years trying to understand why. What they found wasn't laziness. It wasn't incompetence. It was something more systematic. Something built into the fundamental architecture of how knowledge operates inside a human brain. This is Season 2 of MindStack. Over 9 episodes, we have covered 9 psychological mechanisms. Each one is real. Each one is backed by published research. Each one was selected because it directly applies to how you think, how you create, and how you build. But here's the question that actually matters. Did any of it change what you do? Not what you know. Not how you think about your thinking. Not the vocabulary you now use to describe your own hesitation. What you do. If the honest answer is no, or even mostly no, then you have walked straight into the final trap. This video is about that trap. What it is. How it forms in exactly the kind of person who watches psychology content. And how to dismantle it. This is the most important episode of the series. Not because it is the most complex. Because it is the most honest. Let's take inventory. Over the past 9 episodes, you have been exposed to a specific set of psychological frameworks. Each one was selected because it directly applies to the behavior of content creators. Let's walk through what that actually means. You learned about the default mode network, the brain's resting state system, the network that activates when you're not focused on a specific external task. Neuroscientist Markus at Washington University in St. Louis first described this network systematically in 2001 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. His research revealed that this network isn't passive during rest. It is highly active. It consolidates experience, generates future scenarios, and produces the creative associations that show up as ideas. For creators, this knowledge is relevant. It means that stepping away from your desk is not wasted time, that certain cognitive functions require disengagement, that your best ideas are not produced through focused effort alone. That is what you know. You learned about cognitive biases, the systematic, predictable errors in human judgment that affect every decision you make. Confirmation bias leads you to seek information that confirms what you already believe about your content strategy. The availability heuristic causes you to overweight recent examples and underweight statistical patterns. Anchoring causes early numbers, like your first video's view count, to distort your assessment of subsequent performance. These are not character flaws. They are structural features of the human brain documented through decades of experimental research. The foundational work by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in the 1970s and 1980s established these mechanisms so thoroughly that Kahneman received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2002. That is what you know. You learned about decision fatigue, the documented reduction in the quality of decisions that follows a sustained period of deliberate choice-making. Roy Baumeister at Florida State University led some of the early experimental work on this phenomenon through his research on ego depletion, published across multiple papers in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. The core finding is consistent. The brain's capacity for deliberate, effortful decision-making is not unlimited within a single day. Using it depletes it. And creative decisions are among the most demanding operations the prefrontal cortex performs. That is what you know. You learned about the Zeigarnik effect, the psychological tension created by incomplete tasks. Bluma Zeigarnik documented in her 1927 dissertation at the University of Berlin that the mind preferentially recalls and rehearses unfinished business over completed work. For content creators, this mechanism explains why open loops in your videos compel people to return. Why a question asked and not answered at the start of a video is a more powerful retention tool than any visual or musical choice. That is what you know. You learned about metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking. John Flavell at Stanford University defined this concept in its modern form in a 1979 paper in American Psychologist. The capacity to monitor your own cognitive processes is one of the strongest predictors of performance across domains, from academic achievement to professional output. Metacognition allows you to identify when you're operating on autopilot, when your thinking is being distorted by a bias, when your choices are being driven by fatigue rather than judgment. That is what you know. Now the uncomfortable part. In the time since you started this series, how many videos have you published? How many hours have you spent creating compared to how many hours you have spent learning about creating? Has your output increased? Has your retention rate moved? Has anything in your content, your habits, or your results actually changed? For most people watching this, the honest answer involves very little change. That is not a failure of intelligence. You clearly have enough intelligence to follow 9 episodes of applied neuroscience and psychology. That is not a failure of discipline. People who are truly undisciplined don't consume a full series on cognitive architecture. It is something more specific, and understanding it precisely is the most useful thing this series can give you. The knowing-doing gap is not a motivational metaphor. It is a structural feature of how human memory works. To understand it properly, you need to understand how the brain stores and retrieves different types of knowledge. Neuroscientists categorize memory into distinct systems that operate through different neural substrates and serve different functions. The most important distinction for our purposes is between declarative memory and procedural memory. Declarative memory, also called explicit memory, is your memory for facts, events, and conceptual knowledge. When you learned that Markus first described the default mode network in 2001, that information entered your declarative memory system. It is stored primarily in the hippocampus and surrounding medial temporal lobe structures. You can consciously access it. You can state it in words. You can reason about it. Larry Squire, a neuroscientist at the University of California, San Diego and the Veterans Affairs San Diego healthcare system, has spent decades mapping the architecture of human memory systems. His 2004 review paper in the journal Neuron provides one of the clearest accounts of how declarative memory is organized in the brain and how it is distinguished from other memory systems. Procedural memory, also called non-declarative memory, operates entirely differently. This is your memory for skills, habits, automatic behavioral sequences, and conditioned responses. When you ride a bicycle without consciously thinking about balance, when you type without looking at your hands, when an experienced creator opens their editing software and moves through the workflow without deliberating at each step, that is procedural memory in action. It is stored primarily in the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and motor cortex systems. It operates largely outside conscious awareness. It does not use language. You cannot fully articulate it, even when you're doing it. Here is the critical point that most mindset content never addresses directly. These two memory systems are not the same. They do not automatically communicate with each other. They are accessed through different mechanisms. They are built through different processes. And learning something at the declarative level does not automatically produce any change at the procedural level. Read that again. Understanding a concept does not automatically change your behavior. Knowing that decision fatigue reduces the quality of your creative output in the afternoon does not automatically cause you to rearrange your schedule so that creative work happens earlier in the day. That rearrangement has to be physically executed, repeatedly, until the new schedule becomes a procedural habit that runs without deliberation. The knowledge is stored in one system. The behavior lives in another. Between them is a gap that knowledge alone cannot cross. Peter Gollwitzer, a social psychologist at New York University, has spent his career studying exactly this gap. His 1999 paper in American Psychologist, titled Implementation Intentions: Strong Effects of Simple Plans, makes a distinction that most motivation research ignores. There is a difference between a goal intention and an implementation intention. A goal intention is a statement of what you want to achieve. I will post more consistently. I will improve my retention rate. I will build my channel this year. These statements activate the prefrontal cortex. They feel meaningful. They represent genuine motivation. But Gollwitzer's research shows that people with strong goal intentions follow through at surprisingly low rates, particularly when the required behavior is effortful or requires overcoming competing tendencies. An implementation intention is fundamentally different. It is a specific if-then plan that links a situational cue to a concrete action. When it is Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock and I am sitting at my desk, I will record the first 60 seconds of my next video. Not plan it, not think about it. Record it. In multiple controlled experiments, implementation intentions increased goal-directed action by between 200 and 300% compared to goal intentions alone. And crucially, this effect was not produced by increased motivation. The participants in these studies were equally motivated in both conditions. What differed was the cognitive structure they had built around the behavior. The if-then format does something specific. It shifts the initiation of behavior from deliberate decision-making, which is slow, resource-intensive, and affected by fatigue, to situation-triggered response, which is fast, automatic, and largely independent of motivational state. In other words, Gollwitzer's research shows that the creators who execute consistently are not the ones who feel most motivated. They are the ones who have built the most specific behavioral architecture around their creative work. 9 episodes of MindStack gave you conceptual knowledge, declarative memory content. What it cannot give you, because that is not how knowledge transmission works, is the behavioral system that converts understanding into output. That requires something different. But before we get there, we need to go deeper into the trap, because there are 3 specific psychological mechanisms that make the knowing-doing gap significantly worse for people who study psychology and mindset. This is the part that most content in this space never tells you. The standard assumption is that more knowledge leads to better performance. More information, better decisions. More understanding, better execution. The research tells a more complicated story. In specific conditions, increased knowledge actively impairs performance. There are 3 mechanisms that explain why this happens for creators who study psychology. Mechanism 1 is cognitive load. In 1988, educational psychologist John Sweller published a foundational paper in the journal Cognition and Instruction. In it, he introduced cognitive load theory, a framework that would become one of the most influential in educational psychology. The central premise is this. The working memory system, which is the brain's active processing space for current tasks, has strict and measurable capacity limits. Alan Baddeley at the University of York spent decades mapping the architecture of working memory. His model, developed through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, describes a central executive system that manages attentional resources and coordinates cognitive operations. This central executive is responsible for the deliberate, effortful processing that creative work requires. When you are attempting to create content while simultaneously monitoring your own cognitive biases, managing your awareness of decision fatigue, consciously applying open-loop structures, and reflecting on your metacognitive state, you have distributed your working memory resources across multiple demanding operations. The result is not improved performance. It is what researchers call extraneous cognitive load, mental overhead that consumes processing capacity without contributing to the primary task. You are allocating attentional resources to thinking about thinking, and those resources are not available for thinking about the actual creative work in front of you. This is why creators who have studied no psychology often produce more content than creators who have studied a great deal. Not because ignorance improves performance, but because they are not carrying the cognitive overhead of attempting to apply multiple psychological frameworks to every creative decision. Knowledge without integration into automatic behavior produces friction, not fluency. Mechanism 2 is the competence illusion. In 1999, psychologists Justin Kruger and David Dunning at Cornell University published a paper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology titled Unskilled and Unaware of It. This paper has been cited more than 5,000 times in the scientific literature. Its central finding is widely known. People who lack competence in a domain tend to significantly overestimate their ability because they lack the metacognitive sophistication to accurately evaluate their own performance. Kruger and Dunning showed this across multiple domains, including logical reasoning, grammar, and humor. What is less frequently discussed is the inverse pattern that their data also revealed, and that subsequent research has confirmed. As people begin to develop genuine competence in a domain, they often experience a temporary reduction in confidence, not because they are performing worse, because they can now see the gap between their current level and genuinely expert performance in a way that was invisible to them before. For creators who have spent time studying psychology, this mechanism operates in a specific way. You now understand what psychologically optimized content looks like. You can identify when a hook is weak. You can see when a video's structure fails to create the tension needed to sustain attention. You can recognize when your own content lacks the qualities that would make it genuinely effective. And you can see the gap between your current output and what that output would look like if you were executing at the level of understanding you've now developed. That gap is real. It exists. Seeing it clearly is not a dysfunction. It is a sign of genuine cognitive development. But the response that gap generates in most people is not accelerated action. It is hesitation. The feeling that you need to develop further before you're ready to execute at the level you now understand is possible. The sense that posting what you can currently produce would be inconsistent with the standards you now hold. This is the competence illusion operating in reverse. More knowledge produces more awareness of limitations, which produces more reluctance to act. Mechanism 3 is the identity delay. This is the most subtle mechanism and the most resistant to correction through further conceptual knowledge. There is a precise psychological distinction between knowing what creators do and being a creator. Henri Tajfel at the University of Bristol, working alongside John Turner, developed social identity theory in the 1970s and 1980s. Their research demonstrated that self-concept, the internal representation of who you are, is not a passive descriptor. It is an active driver of behavior, perception, and motivation. What you believe about who you are shapes what feels natural, what feels effortful, and what feels like a violation of your own identity. Hazel Markus at Stanford University and Paula Nurius developed the concept of possible selves, published in a 1986 paper in American Psychologist. Their research showed that the gap between your actual self-concept and your imagined future self-concept creates motivational tension that can either drive behavior or produce avoidance, depending on the psychological structure of that gap. For content creators, the identity question operates below the level of conscious decision-making. When you identify as a creator, producing content feels like an expression of who you are. Stopping feels like a violation of your self-concept. The question of whether to post is not a decision you make each time. It is simply what creators do, and you are a creator. When you identify as someone who is learning to become a creator, or studying creativity, or working toward creative output, the dynamic is completely different. Content production feels like homework to be completed when you have prepared sufficiently. Each session of creation is preceded by a moment of assessment. Am I ready? Have I learned enough? Is this good enough to represent what I'm trying to build? Most people who consume mindset and psychology content are in this second category. They are studying the behavior of creators from an external position. The knowledge they are acquiring is genuine. The interest is real. The motivation is real. But the identity hasn't shifted. And without the identity shift, the behavioral change is either temporary or absent. Because the identity is the operating system, the behaviors are the applications. Applications don't run reliably on an operating system that doesn't support them. These three mechanisms, cognitive load, the competence illusion in reverse, and identity delay, are not permanent. Each one can be disrupted, but none of them can be disrupted through further conceptual knowledge. They require something categorically different. They require a system. Now we can name the trap precisely. The final trap is not laziness. It is not lack of intelligence. It is not weak motivation. It is not inconsistency as a character flaw. The final trap is using psychological knowledge as a substitute for creative action. Here is the mechanism as it actually operates. You watch a video about the Zeigarnik effect. You understand it. You think about how you could structure your next video's hook using an open loop. You feel the specific, productive sensation of having acquired something useful. That sensation is neurologically real. Learning activates reward pathways in the brain. Dopamine is involved in the encoding of new information, and its release during learning produces a subjective sense of progress and satisfaction. So you watch another video. You read another article about content psychology. You take notes. You refine your mental model. You build connections between concepts. You feel like you are working towards something, but you have not posted a video. Michael Gazzaniga, a neuroscientist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and one of the most influential figures in cognitive neuroscience, has written extensively about what he calls the interpreter mechanism of the left hemisphere. This is the brain's tendency to construct post hoc narratives that explain and justify current behavior in terms that feel rational and strategic. When you are consuming psychology content in place of creating, the interpreter is generating a very specific story. It sounds like this: I am building a foundation. I am optimizing my approach. When I have developed a thorough enough understanding of how attention and habit formation work, my content will be significantly more effective than if I had started earlier with less preparation. This story feels true. It is internally consistent. It references real concepts. It has the texture of strategic thinking. But if consuming knowledge were the path to creative performance, every person who has watched 100 hours of content creation advice would be an exceptional creator. The research does not support this. The pattern in high performers across domains is consistent. They start earlier, they execute more, they fail faster, they adjust more often, and they accumulate more actual practice hours than people who optimize their understanding before beginning. Adrian Wells at the University of Manchester has documented what he calls metacognitive beliefs, the underlying assumptions people hold about the value and nature of their own thinking processes. One category of maladaptive metacognitive belief is the conviction that extended analysis and self-monitoring are prerequisites for correct action. People who hold this belief strongly tend to engage in excessive rumination. They monitor their own cognitive states in detail. They are highly self-aware, and they frequently underperform compared to people with less sophisticated self-monitoring because their monitoring consumes the resources that would otherwise drive execution. Wells's research makes a distinction that applies directly here. Metacognitive awareness is a tool. Like any tool, it produces useful outcomes when used correctly and harmful outcomes when overused. A saw is useful for building furniture. A saw operating continuously on materials that have already been cut is waste. You have spent 9 episodes developing exactly the level of metacognitive awareness that, without a system to direct it outward toward action, tends to direct itself inward toward further monitoring. This is the Season 2 diagnosis, stated without softening. Knowledge, high. Systems, not yet built. Action, insufficient relative to understanding. This is not a failure. It is an accurate reading of where most people in this audience are at this stage of their development as creators. An accurate diagnosis is the precondition for effective intervention. The map is complete, highly detailed, genuinely useful. The map has not moved you anywhere. The exit from the final trap is not another framework. It is not more reflection on your own cognitive processes. It is not an improved theory of why you haven't been creating. The exit is a system that removes the need to decide. Let's be precise about what that means and why it works at the neurological level. Anders Ericsson was a cognitive psychologist at Florida State University who spent his career studying expert performance across domains including music, chess, sports, and medicine. His 1993 paper with Ralph Kramp and Clemens Teschromer, published in Psychological Review, is titled "The Role of Deliberate Practice in the Acquisition of Expert Performance." It remains one of the most cited papers in all of psychology. Ericsson's central finding was that elite performance is not primarily produced by innate talent. It is produced by a specific type of practice that he called deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is not mere repetition. It is structured, intensive repetition of specific skills just beyond your current ability level, with immediate feedback and conscious adjustment. Deliberate practice does something specific at the neural level. It builds the myelin sheaths around frequently used neural pathways that increase signal transmission speed and reliability. It moves competencies from declarative memory, where they require conscious effort and working memory resources to apply, into procedural memory, where they run automatically and efficiently. The difference between a creator who consciously thinks through every hook they write and a creator who writes effective hooks automatically is not intelligence. It is not taste. It is accumulated hours of deliberate practice that have moved the skill from explicit to implicit processing. Every hour you spend writing hooks that you publish and observe the response to is building toward that automatic competence. Every hour you spend reading about what makes hooks psychologically effective is not. This is not an argument against understanding the psychology. Understanding the psychology of what makes hooks effective is useful as context, as a diagnostic lens, as a framework for evaluating feedback. But understanding without practice does not build the skill. It builds the knowledge of the skill. Those are different things stored in different places in your brain. Gollwitzer's implementation intention research points toward the same conclusion from a behavioral direction. What separates creators who execute consistently from creators who intend to execute consistently is not motivational strength. It is the specificity and situational embeddedness of their behavioral plans. A system is a collection of implementation intentions. It is a set of if-then structures that specify exactly what happens when. When a specific situation occurs, a specific action follows, without deliberation, without self-assessment, without the moment of asking whether conditions are right. You post on Tuesday, not when inspiration is high. Tuesday, you write 3 hook options before you open your editing software, not when you have a good idea, before you open the software. You hit publish when you have reviewed the video twice, not when you are satisfied with it. After 2 reviews, you respond to comments for 15 minutes on the day after posting, not when you feel like engaging. The day after. Each of these structures removes a decision point. And every decision point that exists in your creative workflow is a location where fatigue, self-doubt, the competence illusion, cognitive load, and the identity question can all interrupt execution. Systems do not solve the psychological problems we have covered in this series. They bypass them. They create behavioral channels that run alongside the psychological friction rather than through it. This is why Season 3 exists. Season 2 gave you the psychology. It gave you an accurate map of the cognitive terrain you are operating in. It gave you the vocabulary for identifying what is actually happening when you hesitate, when you overthink, when you drift into consumption rather than production. Season 3 is the system layer. It covers the practical architecture of building income from creative work, not as inspiration, not as strategy in the abstract, but as specific executable systems. How to structure a digital product in a way that removes the daily decision of what to sell. How to build a content workflow that operates on schedule rather than on motivation. How to price your knowledge using frameworks that are determined in advance rather than renegotiated each time. How to set up the automated infrastructure that converts consistent publishing into compounding financial return over time. Every concept in Season 3 is engineered to move something out of the deliberate decision-making system, where it is vulnerable to all the psychological dynamics we have covered, and into automatic, situation-triggered behavior. The psychology was the diagnosis. The systems are the intervention. These are not separable. A system without psychological grounding is a set of rules you follow until motivation drops, and then abandon. A psychological understanding without a system is exactly what we have described in this video, a highly informed state of paralysis. Together, they close the knowing-doing gap. Not because understanding and action are the same thing. They are not. But because a system built with psychological awareness is a system that is architected around the actual cognitive obstacles, rather than a system that assumes those obstacles don't exist. This is the only exit from the final trap. You do not need to understand your mind more thoroughly. You need fewer decision points standing between the work and the world. Season 2 is complete. 9 episodes. 9 mechanisms, each one grounded in published research, each one directly applicable to how you build as a creator. If this series changed how you understand your own psychology, that was the goal. That understanding is real. It has value. But the measurement that matters is not how clearly you can describe the knowing-doing gap. It is whether the gap has narrowed, whether your output has increased, whether the work is actually accumulating. The map is finished. The most detailed map this series could produce. A map is not movement. Season 3 launches soon. It starts where this ended. With systems, with execution architecture, with the infrastructure that converts understanding into output and output into income. Subscribe so you don't miss part 21. Save this video, not because it contains inspiration you'll want to revisit, because it contains a diagnosis. And in several months, after you have been through Season 3 and have been running the systems, it will be useful to come back here and check whether the gap between what you know and what you do is closed. That is the open loop. You know exactly what it does by now. Season 3, soon.